Greetings in Christ, everybody, and welcome to Catholicism and Culture. I am Steve Greene, Director of Holy Family Institute of Catholic Faith and Life. And today I want to talk about the political homelessness of Catholics. In the wake of the political whack-a-mole game that was 2024, it's been increasingly a topic of discussion, at least among a lot of the Catholics that I know, and I would guess quite possibly among some of the Catholics that you know as well. The question of where do Catholics stand in the current political and cultural landscape. It's a topic of a lot of interest. It's a topic of a fair amount of angst, too, at least in the conversations that I've had. And a lot of that stems from the fact that it was unmistakable in the 2024 political cycle, the election year, that a lot of the, I'm going to call it, for lack of a better term, a lot of the moral high ground that had been part of the platform for a long time of the Republican Party was, if not sacrificed, at least compromised, diluted, if not done away with, in the name of political expediency and in a calculated effort to court the undecided voters. Now, of course, the fact is, on Election Day at the polls, the Republican Party won a pretty decisive victory nationwide in both houses of Congress, and of course the executive branch as well. Nonetheless, I think for a lot of devout Catholics, it feels like something of a Pyrrhic victory. The truth is, the Trump administration, at least on paper, and of course we all have to wait and see how the administration actually performs in the next 4 years, but on paper certainly seemed to be the better option where devout and Orthodox Catholics are concerned. And by devout and Orthodox, I don't necessarily mean the personally holiest Catholics, but I mean Catholics who order their decisions in their lives around the tenets and the doctrines and the dogmas of their Catholic faith, and who try to live their life and their faith according to Catholic moral teaching. As we all know, there has not been a perfect political party where Catholic teaching is concerned in the United States ever. So in a sense, Catholics have always been politically homeless, and that's true really in most of the Western world and throughout most of history, at least since Christendom began to unravel at the Protestant Reformation back in the 16th century. Nonetheless, it has in recent decades at least been possible for a serious and devout Catholic to discern which of the two parties was more commensurate with the so-called non-negotiables in Catholic teaching and in Catholic moral law. And non-negotiables like the sanctity of all human life from conception until natural death, traditional or natural marriage, religious freedom, the reality of the human person. Our fundamental Catholic anthropology is being based on the creation of the human person, male and female, in the image and likeness of God. So some of those non-negotiables, there can be confusion over that term, though, non-negotiables. In a sense, it's more a political term than it is a properly Catholic term, but it's meant to clarify that there are certain sets of issues which are of fundamental and foundational importance for Catholics, and really by extension for culture, for society. The goal of any culture, of any society, ought to be to legislate, to govern, to educate, and to make policy in such a way that we are working always in the interest of the citizens, for the flourishing of all human persons, striving for the common good, and trying to build together a sane, just, and virtuous society. In order to meet that goal, it's necessary that we build our entire political project, our entire cultural and social project, on a sound foundation. And so the Church, in her wisdom, has always been very clear that if we are to be successful in building a sane, just, and virtuous human community, we're going to have to found that community on certain non-negotiable principles which are so fundamental and so foundational that if we get them wrong, we will not, even in principle, be capable of building a strong and sober society. Instead, the foundation will be flawed, will be cracked, will have defects and gaps in it that will eventually lead to societal collapse, unless they're fixed, unless the foundation is repaired and made strong again. So to help understand the kind of the basic concept of a non-negotiable where Catholics are concerned, think of, if you're driving home from work one day and you saw a house on fire and a lady outside the house, yelling, "Please help me, my baby is inside." And you see some, heroic man come running up and he "Don't worry, ma'am," and he rushes into the burning house. Smoke is billowing and flames, and you can hear the sirens in the distance, but they're clearly not going to get there in time. The roof is starting to cave in. And so, you watch and everyone just praying that he makes it out of there. And all of a sudden, just instant before the whole house just collapses, the man comes bursting out of the house, and he's just got his arms full of stuff. He's got a violin case, and he's got some photo albums and art, and he's got a fireproof safe deposit box. And he comes out and he just falls to the ground exhausted. All the stuff just spills out on the ground in front of the woman. And the woman is screaming, "Where's my baby? Where's my baby?" And the man looks up and he's like, "Okay, it was super smoky, and I could tell the house was going to collapse. I just had to make some quick decisions." So he said, I got all of your credit cards and your bank statements. So all your financial information, your checkbook, your wallet, your purse, it's all there. And what about my baby? What about my baby? And he says, and I got your photo albums and all of your family DVD collection, your violin and your sheet music and your art, that you had framed in the living room. But what about my baby? What about my baby? And he said, and I got all of your legal documentation, your social security numbers, and your birth certificate. So he said, I just didn't have time to get the baby. I had to decide, and I figured if I could get all this stuff, that'll allow you to start your life over and put all the stuff back in place legally and financially, and all your family. Obviously, the baby was the non-negotiable, meaning if he got everything else, if he got all of her financial information, all of her legal documentation and identity papers, all of her art and her hobbies, her graduation certificate from college and her transcripts, is all that stuff good? Of course that's all good, right? It's your financial stuff, that's good, that's important. Your finances is important. Your legal papers, that's important, establishes your identity, your citizenship, right? That's important. Your photo albums, your art, your education, that's all important. But all of that taken together isn't even nearly as important as the baby. If you got all that stuff, you saved all that stuff, you took care of all that stuff, and you didn't get the baby, all that stuff is worthless. Now just translate that goofy little analogy up to the level of culture, right? So one of the non-negotiables is the sanctity of all human life from the moment of conception until natural death, which means that unless and until a society protects, upholds, defends, promotes the dignity and therefore the rights, the worth of every human person, it doesn't matter what else it gets right. Human life is the non-negotiable. The dignity and the rights of every human person is non-negotiable. And this applies to the unborn at one end of life, and it applies to the elderly and the disabled and the terminally ill and the criminal. It applies to all human persons who might be under threat, who might be in danger if society is built on a shaky foundation where the dignity and the worth of every human life is concerned. We live in one of those societies. We live in a society that aborts unborn children in the millions, that is now passing laws that legalize euthanasia, assisted suicide, that marginalizes and forgets, and possibly in the future, please Lord no, but possibly even exterminates the elderly and the terminally ill, those who are a burden on society. And so for someone to say, well, right, okay, so in America in 2024, maybe we're not as good as we should be on the right to life of all human beings, but, we're really good on economic matters, sound economic policy. We're working on education. We're going to get that figured out, and we're going to get that shored up. And so our education is going to be really solid. Our citizenship and immigration policy, we're putting a lot of attention there. We're going to get that figured out and fixed, too. Those are all important. Of course, they're important, but they're secondary. And if we don't have the fundamental non-negotiables like human life right, society is going to be built on a faulty foundation. It's going to crack. Okay, so back to where are we as Catholics politically in 2024? We're in a situation where I think it's fair to say Catholics, devout, serious Catholics, for whom our Catholic faith is the center of how we organize and prioritize things in our lives, and is also our Catholic faith at the center of how we live our lives politically as citizens in this passing polity. Remember, Christ says we have here no lasting city. St. Paul, says we have here no lasting city, but instead we live as citizens of the world to come. Okay. I think it's safe to say that we are increasingly politically homeless in the United States. It's not just the United States. It's the whole Western world, Western Europe as well, North America, Canada too. We're increasingly politically homeless. We don't have political options where we as devout Catholics can back candidates and can back parties who stand firmly with the Catholic Church on these non-negotiables. Human life and human rights, universal human life and human rights, traditional marriage, an adequate anthropology, created man, woman in the image and likeness of God, religious freedom. And so we're in a tough situation. And here's the difficult thing in a democracy. So some 2,300 years ago, Plato, the great Greek philosopher, of course, wrote his famous work, The Republic. And of course, in The Republic, Plato presents a series of dialogues between Socrates and a number of different interlocutors, and they're trying to work their way through what does a sane, just, and virtuous human society look like? What are its priorities? How should it be structured? And one of the famous / infamous, kind of depending on your perspective, parts of The Republic is that Plato kind of reviews a number of different types of possible governments, a number of different political structures that could run a society, that could govern or rule a society. And he ended up, I won't go all the way into The Republic here. It's a fascinating topic. It's, one of the seminal works of Western civilization. But the interesting piece for the purposes of this conversation is that in ranking kind of a hierarchy of best and worst types of government, Plato actually concluded that democracy, rule by the majority of the citizens, would be the second worst form of government, second only to tyranny. And the reason that Plato reached that conclusion is because he said democracy is, of course, essentially rule by the wishes of the majority. And then he said, well, look at the majority. What motivates most people? He said most people are motivated by the indulgence and satisfaction of their appetites. They live their life motivated by what goes on between their kneecaps and their rib cage, the gut and the loins. And so Plato said, over time, a democracy would devolve into governance by the appetites of the majority. And because power in a democracy derives from courting the support of the majority, the government would be made in the image of the desires of the majority. So the government would have to cater to what the majority wants. What does the majority want? It wants indulgence and satisfaction of its base desires. Plato said, in contrast, what government ought to be for, what society ought to be ordered toward, is the moral perfection of the citizen, the true flourishing in virtue of the human person. He said democracy is ultimately incompatible with that goal. Now, fast forward to 1780 something, after the U.S. Constitution is ratified, John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States, perhaps with Plato in mind, he would certainly have read and studied The Republic. Adams said, of speaking of the U.S. Constitution and its democracy within a republic, Adams said, "Our Constitution is made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly insufficient to the governance of any other." Well, my fellow Catholics, here we are in 2024. We are living in a post-Christian, hence a post-virtue society. This is a problem that the British philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre took up in his great work, After Virtue. He basically laid out for our consideration the fact that we are now living in a post-virtue culture, and that in a post-virtue culture, we were going to have to figure out whether it would even be possible to hold in place all of the values, the priorities, the principles that had made Western civilization the greatest and most successful and most prosperous society in human history. And MacIntyre's take ultimately was that I don't think it can be done. This is also echoed by another great social philosopher, the American social philosopher Will Herberg, looking at the same problem in the 1950s of the rapid decay of moral norms in Western civilization. He came up with a poignant phrase, which I think beautifully expresses the reality that we're all living in, and to the point of this conversation, what we as Catholics are going to have to figure out how to confront. Herberg said, "We are now living in the cut flowers era of Western civilization." What did he mean by that? He meant by that the fact that Western civilization is the branch and blossom of Judeo-Christian roots. It is a culture, a worldview, a polity formed on the theology and the philosophy and the moral law, the natural moral law of the Jewish faith from the Old Testament and the Christian faith from the New Testament, and then, of course, the Catholic Church carrying on that great theological, philosophical, and moral tradition in building the great society of the Middle Ages. Now, Herberg said, and he there's all sorts of different ways you can nuance out when exactly you would say this began, but he said, in the middle 20th century, there can be no mistaking about the fact that we have intentionally and foolishly cut ourselves off from those Judeo-Christian roots, which means we are now, in this period in Western civilization, like cut flowers in a vase. And as we all know, cut flowers in a vase, for a time, retain their beauty and their fragrance. But the minute they're cut off from their roots, they immediately begin dying and decaying. So Herberg was saying, unless and until we reconnect this culture to its Judeo-Christian roots, it will continue, like cut flowers in a vase, to decay and die. That was in the 1950s. Fast forward 70 years to our moment, and you see the decay all around us. It no longer looks as beautiful nor smells as fragrant. We are beginning to see the rot and the decay setting in. So as Catholics in a democracy, we're faced with the reality that in 2024, in order to court the undecided voters and win its decisive political victories, the party which for a time, imperfect though it was at least fairly solid on the non-negotiables, has now begun to compromise, has now begun to dilute its position, has backed off from objective moral truths and objective moral standards on the non-negotiables, and has started to search for middle ground that's politically palatable to the undecided voter, to the demographics that they wanted to court. And like I said at the beginning, they did it successfully, but at what cost? And as devout Catholics, that I think is the troubling part of this conversation. There is not a clear option politically now. We can say perhaps overall option A is better than option B, whether we're talking about a party or a particular candidate or two competing pieces of legislation meant to address a similar issue. Regardless of what we're considering politically, we're no longer in a place where we can discern fairly clearly where the non-negotiables are being upheld. And this is a real problem. So where does that leave us then as Catholics? It leaves us with the reality that in this democracy within a republic where the majority rules and where politicians come to power and maintain themselves in power by courting the majority opinion, we are going to have to begin the long, slow, arduous process of trying, with the help and the grace of Almighty God, to reconnect this culture to its Judeo-Christian roots. to the Second Vatican Council, one of the themes that ran through the Second Vatican Council was the mission of lay Catholics, what the Second Vatican Council referred to as the apostolate of the laity. Apostolate is just a fancy church term for the work of the church, which was entrusted to the apostles in Matthew 28, go therefore make disciples of all nations. And that work entrusted to the apostles has been handed down to their successors, the bishops and the Pope, but it's also been handed down to the lay faithful. We are co-workers in the vineyard of the Lord. And so we are also, as the lay faithful, called to go and make disciples of all nations, to go out into the highways and the byways, to permeate the culture. And this theme that ran through the Second Vatican Council, which was convened, of course, in the early to mid-1960s, recognized very clearly that the culture around the church has changed fundamentally and is no longer a Christian culture, is no longer a culture formed by a Christian worldview, guided by Christian moral teaching. The church said now is the time where the mission of the laity is to permeate, to penetrate, and to perfect the temporal order. Temporal order, just a fancy term for the mundane, everyday life of culture. So we lay Catholics have to bring Christ out into the world so that Christ can bring the world to himself. As we know, and the statistics bear this out, fewer and fewer people are coming to the church, which means the church has to go out into the highways and byways of our culture and find them. That's mostly going to be the work of the laity. This includes, by the way, and of course you're watching this video online, this includes the internet and social media, which Pope Benedict referred to in a very interesting phrase, referred to as a new digital continent. So we can think of the internet and social media as like an eighth continent, a digital continent. But think of the natives of this digital continent. It is a dark and pagan continent, desperately in need of evangelization. Now, does that mean every Catholic should be online evangelizing? No. We should become experts and consistent practitioners of in-person evangelization before we ever try to take it online. And when we're evangelizing, whether in person or online, the old adage, if you can't love the person you're evangelizing, you are not called to evangelize them, is true both in person and online. And especially online because, of course, as we know, we run into the cowards with a keyboard reality of people who hide behind avatars and say horrible and vulgar and insulting things that they would never have the courage to say face-to-face to a fellow human being. We have to be especially patient, especially charitable, especially humble, and especially willing to turn the other cheek if we're evangelizing online. Nonetheless, the greater message is, at this particular moment, we Catholics are increasingly politically homeless. There is no single political party which is solid on all the non-negotiables, and we have seen a shift away from moral absolutes and moral truth to moral compromise in order to court undecided voters and win political victories. We as Catholics then need to stand strong. We need to be a city on a hill, a beacon in the darkness. We need to be the luminous presence of Jesus Christ in our social lives, in our family lives, and in our political lives and activities, so that we can begin slowly rebuilding a majority who see and understand the great truth, goodness, and beauty with which we as Catholics have been entrusted. And so that as more and more people fall through the cracks, as more and more people are wounded, damaged, left behind, disillusioned by the lies and the nonsense and the sin and the brokenness that our culture is pushing on people, that the church remains a safe haven and a home, and as Pope Francis said, a field hospital for the many victims of this culture of darkness and despair and death. So that's the work. That's a sobering task to face. Impossible. It seems like there's an unmeetable need out there. And who are we? Who am I? Little old me. What can I do? This is where it's important for us to remember one final thing, and I'll close here. Praise God, the work of transforming and redeeming this culture is His work, not ours. This is Christ's work, the Holy Spirit's work, not ours. What we're called to do, faced with this unmeetable need in the culture, is exactly what the apostles were called to do 2,000 years ago on that lonely hillside when they brought the needs of the 5,000, starving, hungry, tired, in this remote place to Jesus. And He said, you give them something to eat. and they said, all we have is 5 loaves and 2 fish, laughably insufficient. But he said, give it to me. And Jesus blessed it, Jesus multiplied it, and Jesus met the need. So what we're called to do in this culture is offer our 5 loaves and 2 fish and trust it to Christ and let him do the great work that needs to be done. So thanks so much for watching. Remember to subscribe, like, and share. That helps us immensely, of course, on YouTube. And thanks for watching Catholicism and Culture. Until next time, remember, the church has what the world needs. So learn your faith, live your faith, and share your faith.